Milchester awoke under a sky of heavy gray, the kind of sky that threatened rain but never quite delivered. It was the sort of weather that made people walk faster, speak softer, and glance over their shoulders, as if the clouds themselves were listening. Miss Marple, however, was already in her garden by 7, pruning a stubborn rosebush with gentle but precise snips. The dew clung to the hem of her skirt, and the distant toll of the chapel bell marked the hour. But her thoughts were far from the stems and thorns in her hands. The truth, she now suspected, lay not in what people had done recently but in what they had buried years ago and then quietly reshaped to suit their needs. The note in Harold's pocket, the hidden second half, the photograph from the past, the barely acknowledged parentage of Sally Briggs, all threads in a carefully concealed tapestry. And someone had tugged too hard. She had just returned to her kitchen when a knock came at the front door. Not hurried, but firm. She opened it to find Sergeant Paris standing stiffly, his notebook tucked beneath his arm. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, voice unusually clipped. "May I have a word?" "Of course, Sergeant." "Come in." "I have water just boiled." He declined the tea but took a seat at her small kitchen table, glancing around with what might have been discomfort, or simply fatigue. "We've received a new statement," he said. "From a Mr. Leslie Wicks, groundskeeper at the vicarage." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "He was near the potting shed that day, wasn't he?" Paris nodded. "Claims he saw someone enter the greenhouse shortly before the body was found. A woman, in gloves. Said he remembered because it struck him as odd a sunny day, no mud, and yet she wore gloves." "Did he see her face?" "Number." "Just the gloves and a quick glimpse of hair." "But he was certain she was holding something." "A bit of paper, folded." "Tucked it quickly into a coat pocket." Miss Marple's thoughts leapt immediately to Prunella's velvet coat and the fox head pin that had been found broken in the grass. "She denied speaking to Harold that day," Miss Marple said softly. Paris scratched the back of his neck. "She denies a lot. But there's more. Wicks didn't want to come forward at first because, well, a broken bar, he has a bit of history with Arthur Welby. Disputes over land rights on the boundary between their properties. Thought it might look personal. I imagine it was." Paris sighed. "Thing is, Jenny, a broken bar, none of this is sticking. Welby had a motive, sure. But no real opportunity. Mrs. Simmons had a feud, but not enough to warrant a murder." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Unless it wasn't rage, but self-preservation." Paris glanced up. She didn't want Harold to reveal something to Sally. Something that would shatter the narrative this village has accepted. Perhaps Prunella feared what it would do to her own reputation. Still seems a lot to kill for. "It always seems like a lot," Miss Marple replied. "Until one remembers how very small some people's worlds are. Later that day, Miss Marple made her way up the narrow lane leading to the Briggs cottage on the village's outskirts. It was a modest place, with whitewashed walls and a slate roof, tucked behind overgrown hedges. Sally answered the door looking pale and flustered, as though she hadn't slept properly in days. "Miss Marple?" she said. "Is something wrong?" "No, dear. I was hoping you might join me for a little walk." The air does wonders when one is carrying questions. Sally hesitated, then nodded and fetched her coat. They walked together along the path by the old mill stream, boots crunching against pebbled earth. Birds chirped weakly overhead, and a low mist clung to the grass along the banks. "I've been thinking about you," Miss Marple said gently. "About your grandmother. You were raised by her, yes?" "Yes. She passed when I was 15. After that, I managed on my own." "She told you your parents had died in an accident?" "Yes. A train accident." I never questioned it. "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "there's no official record of such an accident involving your parents' names in that year." Sally stopped walking. "Yeah, I don't understand." Miss Marple turned to face her. "Sometimes, the stories we're told are designed not to explain the truth, but to protect someone's idea of what is proper. But you deserve the truth, my dear. I believe Harold Fothergill was your father." Sally's lips parted, but no words came. She looked stricken less from disbelief and more from a sudden, violent recognition. "I saw him once," she whispered. "When I was little. He came to the cottage. I was sent outside to play. I remember peeking through the window. He gave my grandmother money." She was crying. Miss Marple nodded. "I believe he supported you financially, quietly. And for a time, perhaps that was enough for him. But not in the end. I think he meant to tell you. I think he had grown tired of secrets." Sally's voice shook. "Why would anyone want to stop him?" Miss Marple hesitated. "There are people in this village who benefit from what is not said. If Harold acknowledged you, others would be forced to confront their roles in the deception." Sally lowered her head. "I just wanted to know who I was." "And you shall, my dear," said Miss Marple. "But first we must make sure no one else is hurt by silence." That evening, just before dusk, Miss Marple returned home and found an envelope slipped under her front door. No stamp. Just her name. Inside was the torn photograph again. But this time, there was a note folded behind it. In careful block letters, "You're looking in the wrong place." She wasn't the only one with something to lose. Miss Marple read it 3 times. Then she turned back to her fire and sat very still. The fox head pin. The velvet coat. The torn note. The promise of a confession. But now something had shifted. Someone else had something to lose. And it was time to look beyond the velvet and the gardener's feud. There was another player in this story. Someone who had blended into the background so perfectly they'd never even been considered. But Jane Marple, eyes gleaming in the firelight, had begun to see the outlying form. And she intended to follow Ida no matter how politely it had hidden behind smiles, cakes, or committee meetings. Because in Milchester, even niceties could kill. Chapter 7, The quiet one who watched. The following day dawned with the rain so fine and persistent it felt more like the village was being slowly dissolved than soaked. The rooftops of Milchester ran with silver threads, and the streets glistened like polished slate. Miss Marple, however, remained unaffected by the gloom. She had lived long enough to know that storms of weather of the sky or the soula often preceded clarity. She had spent the morning going over everything again, the photograph, the torn note, the fox-head pin, the gloves, the will, the anonymous letter. But it was that final sentence, she wasn't the only one with something to Lucia that now echoed in her mind like a bell tolling at the wrong hour. For days, the village's attention had focused on Prunella Simmons and Arthur Welby. That was natural. They were the ones with the most visible history with Harold Fothergill. They were the names whispered over scones, the faces scrutinized in the post office queue. But the sender of the anonymous note, whoever they were, had urged her to look elsewhere. Someone else had been hiding in plain sight. Miss Marple's thoughts turned, curiously, to Mrs. Emery. Florence Emery had seemed almost peripheral until now. The village piano teacher. A woman of mild manners and moderate taste, whose only Crimea until now had been overly ambitious treacle tarts and a fondness for other people's business. She had been present at the garden show, of course she was always present. She had even been among the first to spread word of the fox-head pin. And yet a broken bar, there was something just a little too convenient about how quickly she had connected the pin to Prunella Simmons. Something rehearsed. At precisely 11:30, Miss Marple slipped into her mackintosh, fetched her umbrella, and stepped out into the drizzle. Her path took her not to the rose thistle or the churchyard, but instead to a small brick house on Maple Tree Lane, Mrs. Emery's. The door was opened by Florence herself, who blinked in surprise. "Jane. What a fright you gave me. Do come in, do come in. I've just put on a fresh pot." Miss Marple entered with a warm smile. The drawing room was exactly as expected, tidy, floral, and slightly too pink. The tea service was laid out with impressive precision. "I was just thinking about you," Mrs. Emery chirped, bustling about. "This murder business, so frightful. Though if I'm being honest, it's done wonders for the foot traffic at the bakery. People always want pastry when they're discussing blood." Miss Marple offered a pleasant murmur, her eyes quietly absorbing the room. "Tell me, Florence," she said, once they were seated, "you've known nearly everyone in Milchester for, 20 years? Longer, I'd say." I knew Harold before he married. You know, his first piano teacher was my cousin Isabel. Did Harold ever strike you as a man with the broken bar secrets? Florence paused mid-pour. Don't we all have a few tucked away, dear? Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. Some more damaging than others. Mrs. Emery smiled thinly. What is this, Jane? A social call or an interrogation? Just an observation, Miss Marple said softly. You've always had such a remarkable memory. Do you remember seeing anyone in gloves on the day of the garden show? Gloves? Florence blinked. Well, a broken bar number. I don't think so. Except, of course, Prunella. She always wears gloves. Part of her ridiculous airs. Funny, said Ms. Marple mildly. Mr. Wicks, the groundskeeper, also mentioned a woman in gloves. Not Prunella, though. Said the coat was darker. Mrs. Emery's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup. Well. Perhaps someone borrowed a coat. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed. Though it would be an odd coincidence that you were the one who pointed out the fox head pin before the police even mentioned it. A pause. I'm just observant, Florence said. Indeed. As am I. And I noticed that the pin wasn't shown to the public. It was found quietly by Constable Roper and handed to Sergeant Paris. So you must have heard it from some in a broken bar or seen it before the constable arrived. Silence settled over the room like a dropped curtain. Miss Marple continued gently, the curious thing about murder, Florence, is that it tends to disturb old arrangements. Secrets become burdens. Allegiances crumble. And those who were once protected may suddenly find themselves vulnerable. Florence's composure was beginning to fray. Her voice, when she spoke, was lower, harder. You think I killed Harold? I think you knew what he was about to do. I think you realized he would tell Sally the truth. That he had finally gathered the courage to speak the one secret that had kept so many bound in silence. Florence set her cup down with a loud clink. It was his fault, she said sharply. All of it. He knew what that truth would do, not just to Prunella or Arthur, but to Sally. And to me. Miss Marple waited. She's my niece, Florence said, almost spitting the words. Not my sister's child, as people believed. My daughter. From a time I'd rather forget. I gave her up to my mother and moved away. Then Harold came back offering his money, acting the savior. Tears sprang unbidden to her eyes. He had no right to come back after all those years and play father. Not when he left me alone. Not when he ruined everything. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. So when he told you he would speak to Sally, you followed him to the greenhouse. "I didn't mean to hurt him," Florence whispered. "I just wanted to stop him. I tried to take the note." He pulled away and Tripita fell against the grates. "It was an accident." "But you didn't call for help." "I panicked. I took the other half of the note. I left." "I didn't mean to." Miss Marple rose slowly. "I believe you didn't plan murder, Florence. But you did commit it." Outside, the rain had grown heavier. The windows misted at the edges. "Please," Florence said, voice hollow, "don't tell Sally. Let her remember him kindly. It's better that way." Ms. Marple turned to the door, her voice soft but resolute. "It's no longer about preserving illusions. It's about restoring what was denied. And she deserves the truth, however painful." An hour later, Miss Marple stood quietly in the small police office of Milchester, her statement delivered, her part complete. Sergeant Parris said nothing at first. He simply looked down at the confession Miss Marple had helped secure, then at the broken woman now sitting pale and silent in the holding room next door. "It's always the ones you least suspect," he said. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "It's always the ones who've been watching the longest." And she walked out into the rain, alone. Chapter 8, Truths Told in Twilight. The rain continued for most of the night, a steady murmur on rooftops and window panes, as if the village itself were mourning. Milchester, so often cloaked in the comfort of routine and pleasantries, now sat in a kind of suspended quiet like a theater where the curtain had dropped too soon. Miss Marple awoke early. She had slept soundly, not out of peace, but out of necessity. There is a particular exhaustion that comes after moral clarity, a kind of stillness that settles only once the burden of truth has been passed on. And now that it had, she knew her role was nearly complete. The police had taken Florence Emery into custody the night before. Her confession, quiet, broken, but complete, had made the task easier than most. Sergeant Parris had been respectful, even gentle, though his face had looked older than it had in the weeks prior. Miss Marple stood by the sitting-room window with her tea, watching the mist rise off the hedgerows. She thought of Florencia, once a lively girl in the village choir, then a watchful woman with too many regrets. It was a sad business. But then, most crimes were born not from evil, but from hurt left too long to fester. Just as she was setting her cup down, there came a knock at the front door. It was Sally. Her cheeks were flushed from the wind, her coat damp at the shoulders. But her eyes, though steady, uncertain eyes, held something different today. Not fear, but readiness. "I heard," she said simply, once Miss Marple had let her in. Miss Marple gestured toward the kitchen. "Would you like some tea, dear?" Sally shook her head. "Number. I don't think I can sit. I need to know. All of it. Please." Ms. Marple nodded. She moved slowly to the fire and stirred it with the poker, more for rhythm than necessity. Your grandmother, whom you believe to be your mother, was Florence Emery. She was young, unmarried, and afraid. When she became pregnant, she and her family decided to raise you under the appearance that you were her niece. Such arrangements are more common than people admit, particularly in villages where appearances are everything. Sally stood still, absorbing it. Harold Fothergill, Miss Marple continued, was your father. I believe he contributed financially, though he kept his involvement hidden. For years, he let the truth sit untouched. But something changed. Perhaps he regretted the silence. Perhaps he believed it was time you knew. Sally spoke softly. He was going to tell me, wasn't he? That's what the note was. Yes. He wrote it just before he died. Or rather, just before he was killed. He tried to speak to your mother, one last time. And she, in fear and desperation, tried to stop him. Sally closed her eyes. Miss Marple approached her gently. She didn't intend to kill him, my dear. But her guilt and her panic led her to cover it up. That is the truth, painful as it is. Sally nodded, slowly. All this time a broken bar I wanted to know who I was. And now a broken bar you still are, said Miss Marple, placing a hand on hers. You are kind. Honest. Brave. That is yours alone, not something inherited. But now, at least, the silence is gone. And with it, the shadow. There were no tears, not yet. Just a long breath that sounded like release. I'm glad you told me, Sally said, and then, what happens now? Miss Marple sighed. The law will take its course. But as for you, that is for you to decide. You are free now, Sally. And that is a rare thing. Later that day, the village began to shift its gaze once again. The news, though not shouted, made its way through cottages and shops like smoke on the wind. Mrs. Emery arrested. Harold Fothergill not tripped, but struck. And Sally Briggs, poor girl, left with the echo of too many truths. The rose thistle fell into an unusual hush. Conversations, once bursting with speculation and intrigue, now carried a relevant undertone. She did it for the girl, said Miss Hartnell with a sigh. Imagine a burden. I suppose, muttered Mr. Peel, but it's always the quiet ones, isn't it? The ones who notice too much. I always said Florence had a storm behind her eyes, added Mrs. Blackwell, who had, in fact, never said any such thing before. But amid the murmuring, some chose silence. Prunella Simmons, for one, had not left her house since the arrest. Arthur Welby had been seen walking alone along the lane by the mill, hat in hand, head bowed. Miss Marple watched them all with the faintest sadness. The true damage of such events was not in the act itself, but in the ripples it left behind and the broken friendships, the shaken foundations, the memories recast in darker tones. Still, the truth was better than the illusion. Always. That evening, Reverend Pilling invited Miss Marple to the vicarage for a quiet supper. Over bowls of leek and potato soup, they spoke in the soft tones that follow a storm. "Do you ever grow tired of seeing the worst in people?" he asked gently. "I never see the worst," Miss Marple replied. "Only the parts they try hardest to hide." He smiled. "You've done something good, Jane. For the village. For Sally." "Perhaps," she said. "But it would have been better if someone had done it sooner." Secrets rot like fruit left in the sun. The fire crackled in the hearth beside them, and the rain had finally stopped. Outside, the moon emerged over Milchester, shy but steady. Later, as Miss Marple returned to her cottage and slipped out of her coat, she noticed a small envelope had been tucked under the front door again. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single scrap of paper. No name. No handwriting. Just one line, typed, "Thank you for giving me back my name." Miss Marple read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it on the mantel. She looked around the quiet room, a familiar, warm, unchanged, and gave a small nod to herself. Another shadow gone. Another secret turned to light. Chapter 9, Ashes in the Greenhouse. It was the following morning when Miss Marple received the unexpected visit. The day had begun peacefully. The skies were clear for the first time in a week, and a mild sun dappled her front garden. She had just settled into her armchair with a fresh cup of tea and the latest letter from her nephew Raymond, full of amusing complaints about a failed literary luncheon in Oxford, when she heard brisk footsteps on the gravel outside. A moment later, the knock came. It was Sergeant Paris. He looked less tense than in previous days, but there was a flicker of curiosity behind his tired eyes, an expression Miss Marple had learned to associate with something unresolved. "Good morning, Sergeant," she said as she opened the door. "Come in, come in. You look as though you've come with a thought you don't quite trust yet." Paris smiled thinly. "That's not far off, ma'am." He followed her into the sitting room, accepted a cup of tea with habitual politeness, and sat stiffly on the edge of the armchair, as if unsure how long he meant to stay. "I've come from the greenhouse," he began. "We've been doing a final sweep, a routine, really. The murder scene's been processed, but we hadn't yet cleared the storage boxes behind the main bench. The corner where Harold used to keep old seed trays and potting soil." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And? We found ashes. Not unusual in a potting shed." Paris held up a hand. "Not wood ashes, Miss Marple. Paper. Burnt documents. Some partly intact." Now she leaned forward slightly. "We've managed to piece together some of what was burned. Pages from a diary or a personal notebook, we think. They weren't all Harold's handwriting, either. There are two distinct hands. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. And what did they say? Nothing directly incriminating. But one line stood out. It was scrawled in red pencil, If she ever finds out the child is hers, it will undo everything. Miss Marple paused, cup halfway to her lips. The child is hers? Paris nodded. We don't know who Ashley is, or what arrangement it refers to. But the phrasing suggests that even the version of events we know of Florence's story, Harold's plan to tell Sally, might not be the full truth. Miss Marple sat back slowly, her expression unreadable. You believe someone else was involved in hiding Sally's true identity? I think, Paris said quietly, that perhaps Florence wasn't the only one with something to protect. And maybe not even the worst offender. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked alone to the edge of Milchester, toward the very plot where the old greenhouse stood. The vicarage was quiet. Reverend Pilling was away for the day attending a funeral in South Denham, and the grounds were empty but for the birds in the wind. The greenhouse, long associated with Harold Fothergill and his prize chrysanthemums, was padlocked now, the door half-hinged, its frame beginning to show wear. But the side bench of the one where the ashes had been found was still accessible through the small broken pane Harold had meant to repair for months. She reached in carefully with her umbrella and tapped open the bench's lid. Inside were only remnants now, soil-stained rags, fragments of terracotta pots, and the faint scent of burned paper. Miss Marple stood very still, eyes narrowing. There was something else, a slip of oilcloth at the base of the bench, pressed flat beneath a pile of empty sea trays. She knelt carefully and drew it out. Wrapped inside was a single object, a pocket mirror. Cracked, worn. Not valuable. But it bore the initials P.S. Prunella Simmons. Miss Marple rose, slowly brushing the dirt from her skirt. She had no proof, not yet, but her instincts had shifted. Florence had believed she was protecting a lie she'd carried for years. But what if the lie was handed to her? What if Florence had not been the mother at all but Prunella? And what if Harold had finally decided to correct that lie, to give Sally not just her father's name, but her mother's too? That would explain the desperation. The urgency in the note. The sense that Sally needed to know before Harold passed. And it would explain the panic in Prunella's eyes when Miss Marple had last visited. Miss Marple did not go directly to Prunella's that day. She returned home instead, prepared a light supper, and sat with her notebook, outlining every event again from the beginning. Sally was raised believing Florence was her aunt. Harold supported her education quietly, visited rarely. Florence carried the secret for decades but it was never spoken aloud, not even in confession. Prunella had remained unusually quiet during the investigation. And the fox had been, yes, it had been hers. But had she been present that day after all? Florence had claimed she hadn't seen Harold since November. But Prunella? She had lied openly to Miss Marple about her movements at the garden show. And that changed everything. The next day, Miss Marple returned to Prunella's cottage on Sycamore Lane. She found the older woman in her drawing room, sipping brandy at 10 in the morning, her hands fidgeting with the edge of a handkerchief. "I wondered when you'd come," she said, her voice brittle. "It's been awful." Poor Florence. Miss Marple sat down across from her and offered a gentle nod. "Indeed." Poor Florence. There was a long pause. Then Miss Marple said, "I found something in the greenhouse." Prunella's hand stilled. "Something of yours," Miss Marple continued softly. "A mirror." "With your initials." It was wrapped and hidden beneath a pile of seed trays. Prunella closed her eyes. Miss Marple's voice dropped further. "I believe you were there that day. I believe Harold told you he was going to tell Sally the truth, not about Florence, but about you." Prunella didn't speak. "I think he asked you to step forward. To take responsibility for the life you'd hidden. And I think you refused. Perhaps you even threatened to expose Florence's arrangement. Perhaps you burned the rest of the letters he had written to Sally. Perhaps you meant only to frighten him." A broken bar. A long silence followed. Then Prunella said, very softly, "I gave her up. My parents insisted. Florence took her on, said she would raise her as a sister. I went on with my life. Married someone else. I never saw Sally again until she was 10. And by then a broken bar I cooled into broken bar. I didn't know how to go back." Her voice cracked. "But Harold, he was going to ruin everything. My whole life. All those years of keeping the secret for nothing." Miss Marple stared at her with quiet, unwavering eyes. "You didn't kill him," she said. "But you pushed him." Prunella looked away. Miss Marple stood, her voice neither cruel nor kind. "The police will decide what to do with that. But I suggest, for Sally's sake, you tell the truth. She deserves her whole story and not just the version that suits your dignity." As she walked to the door, Prunella called out, not pleading, but hollow, "Do you think she'll ever forgive me?" Miss Marple turned. "Forgiveness must be earned. But truth is the first step." She left the cottage with the wind behind her, rustling the sycamore leaves like whispers. There were still shadows to clear. But the light had finally begun to spread. Chapter 10, The Shape of the Truth. The sun hung low over Milchester that Sunday evening, casting a soft gold over the churchyard and bathing the village cottages in a warm, forgiving light. It was a rare stillness, the kind that only came after a storm, when the air felt lighter, not from joy, but from the burden of truth finally spoken. Inside the vicarage hall, chairs had been arranged in quiet rows, the kind used for committee meetings and charity concerts. But tonight, there were no scones, no bunting. Only a small circle of villagers: Miss Marple, Sergeant Paris, Reverend Pilling, Sally Briggs, and, seated stiffly apart from the rest, Prunella Simmons. She had come, which surprised everyone. No summons, no arrest. Merely a note from Miss Marple requesting her presence, and she had arrived dressed not in her usual velvet and fox fur, but in a plain navy coat, her face drawn and stripped of its usual theater. Miss Marple stood at the center, hands folded, quiet as always. "I've asked you all here," she began gently, "because there are times when the court cannot resolve what the village must live with. This is one of those times." Sally sat quietly in the front row. Her gaze never left Miss Marple, though the woman seated behind her real mother drew the occasional glance like a shadow passing through light. "Harold Fothergill did not die by accident," Miss Marple said. "We know this now. He was killed in a moment of panic by a woman who feared that a long-held secret would finally come to light." She nodded toward the back. "That woman was Florence Emery. She confessed to Ida sincerely and fully, and she will answer for it. But in her confession, she also said something we now know was untrue. She claimed she was Sally's mother. She was not." A hush settled over the room, though no one gasped. Most had suspected it in some way. But there is a difference between gossip and confirmed truth. "Prunella Simmons," Miss Marple said calmly, "is Sally's mother." Prunella did not move. She sat ramrod straight, her hands white-knuckled on her lap. For years, she lived with the knowledge and said nothing. She allowed Florence to carry the burden of raising Sally under a lie, protecting a reputation that had already faded. And when Harold Fothergill decided to tell the truth, to give Sally the name and identity she deserved, it frightened her. Miss Marple's eyes didn't flinch. She went to the greenhouse to stop him. They argued. In the struggle, he fell. She left, unseen. And later, Florence arrived and found what she believed was the unraveling of the very lie she had spent her life protecting. She completed the concealment not knowing she was covering for someone else. Sally turned around slowly. Her gaze met Prunella's. There was no fury in her eyes. Only ache. "I didn't mean to let it go on so long," Prunella whispered. "I was a girl. Scared. My family insisted we hide it. They sent me away. When I came back, Florence had taken you in. She said you were better off never knowing. She said we'd ruined your chance at a normal life." Tears slid down her cheeks, ungracefully. "I wanted to tell you. So many times. But each year made it harder. And by the time Harold came back into our lives, I wasn't brave enough." Sally did not respond at first. But after a long silence, she spoke not to Miss Marple, not to the others, but directly to the woman who had once chosen pride over truth. "You should have told me," she said. "You should have told me before I had to learn it from someone else." Then she stood and walked to the door. At the threshold, she paused and turned slightly. "But I'm glad I know now. Whoever I am, at." She looked at him for a long time. "Did he see you with Elsie?" "Number. I left before she came. I saw her walking up the drive as I was leaving through the side." Miss Marple studied him. If he was lying, it was buried deep beneath years of grief. If he was telling the truth, then someone else had taken advantage of that quiet moment. Someone with more to lose than a wounded man with a cane and a memory. She rose. "Thank you, Mr. Veal." He said nothing. But as she stepped back into the crisp late afternoon, Miss Marple knew the story was almost fully formed. Now it was time to find out who had made sure the past remained buried, even if it meant drowning the future with it. Chapter 7, An Invitation to Tea. By Thursday morning, the tone in street Mildred's had shifted from hushed horror to morbid curiosity. The gossip, though still veiled in delicate phrasing, had grown bolder. Everyone seemed to have a new theory. The fishmonger's wife was convinced the Major was poisoned first. The postmistress whispered to customers that the garden pond was an old smuggler's burial spot. And young Lily Partridge insisted she'd heard ghostly footsteps outside the larches at night, though her mother firmly blamed the wind and too many rhubarb tarts. But in the sitting room of Rose Cottage, Miss Marple was not indulging in rumor. She was rereading the torn letter from the Major's wallet for the 5th time, this time focusing not on the words, but on the ink. Brownish, slightly faded. Older than it appeared. Written by hand that had once been graceful, now stiff with time. And the initial at the end, M. Not Miriam, Elsie's mother, certainly not if the letter had been written after she died. Which meant someone else had written it. Someone else knew about the Major's daughter. And someone else, Miss Marple suspected, knew he had returned. By mid-morning, she had set her plan in motion. She sent a handwritten note by Lily Partridge, who was delighted to be entrusted with something so exciting, to Mrs. Daventry at the Larches. It read simply, "Dear Mrs. Daventry, I hope you might join me for tea today at 4. I believe we might have a few matters worth discussing quietly. Warmly, Jane Marple." She knew the effect of a letter like that. Not a threat, nor a request, just enough suggestion of knowledge to stir an uneasy conscience. Sure enough, at precisely 4 o'clock, Mrs. Daventry arrived, flushed, faintly scented, and altogether too composed. "Miss Marple," she said, settling into the chintz armchair. "You do enjoy your little games." "Not games, my dear," Miss Marple said pleasantly, pouring the tea. "Merely a broken bar observations. One learns a great deal simply by watching how people pour milk, or avoid the topic of footprints." Mrs. Daventry's smile didn't falter, but the teacup in her hand trembled ever so slightly. "I suppose you've spoken to everyone now?" The housemaid, the inspector, the mysterious man with the limp. "Simon Veal," Miss Marple said. though you likely knew him as Alan Forsyth. He lived here once, years ago. Briefly. You were still Miss Rowena Grant back then, I believe. Mrs. Daventry stiffened. I don't know what you mean. Oh, I think you do. You knew them both. Redburn and Forsyth. And more importantly, you knew what happened in Kenya. A long silence. The ticking of the mantel clock filled the room. Then Mrs. Daventry placed her cup down, not delicately. I suppose you've already decided what you think happened. No, Miss Marple said. But I know what I suspect. And it's that this entire affair of the pond, the cane, the letter wasn't just about a guilty man being found. It was about someone being silenced before the truth could emerge. Mrs. Daventry looked away. You think I killed him? I think you had more reason than anyone. You rented him the room. You knew his habits. You had access to the garden, the shed, the evening sherry. And more than that, you had a connection to that letter. Mrs. Daventry's eyes narrowed. You can't prove that. No, Ms. Marple admitted. Not yet. But I can observe. And I've observed that your handwriting on the invitation to the Flower Committee meeting last month has the same downward slant, the same looping AD, and the same final flourish as the letter signed AM. Mrs. Daventry's hands clenched in her lap. Why? Miss Marple asked gently. Why write to him after all these years? Mrs. Daventry stood suddenly, pacing the length of the room like a bird seeking the nearest window. I loved him, she said quietly. Once. Before he left. Before I learned what he truly was. He promised everything. Said we'd go to Nairobi together. I was young. Foolish. And then he left. No explanation. I later learned from a letter meant for someone else here that there had been a child. That he had lied to me. Lied to Miriam. Lied to everyone. So you wrote to him, Miss Marple said. To confront him. Yes, she whispered. I told him I hoped he'd face her. That he'd acknowledge what he'd done. But he never answered. Never even mentioned it when he arrived at my doorstep asking to rent the East Wing. You let him stay. I wanted to see. To understand. But he was the same as ever. Cold. Distant. He avoided Elsie like the plague when he realized who she was. I saw it in his face at the picnic. And that night? Mrs. Daventry turned slowly. I confronted him in the drawing room. Told him she was here. That he could not pretend she didn't exist. And he laughed. I left Africa to forget," he said. "You should have done the same." Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes. "I didn't plan to kill him, Miss Marple. But I hated him in that moment. I wanted him to pay. But I didn't. A broken bar. She collapsed into the armchair. Miss Marple rose and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I believe you. But someone else didn't stop at wanting." Mrs. Daventry looked up. "You think it was the Monith, the one with the limp?" "No," Miss Marple said calmly. "He came for confrontation, not blood. I believe the true killer had far more to lose. And far more to protect." Mrs. Daventry blinked. "Elsie?" "No," Miss Marple said. "But someone for her." She walked to the window. "You must prepare yourself. The truth will not wait quietly anymore. And justice, even delayed, arrives with steady feet." Outside, the street was beginning to empty. Lamps flickered on one by one, and the church bell chimed 6. The hour of reckoning was drawing near. Chapter 8. The visitor at dusk. The following evening brought a crisp breeze and a faint drizzle enough to leave droplets on the hedgerows and turn the cobbled paths of street. Mildred slick and glistening. It was not a night for walking, and yet Miss Marple found herself stepping out once more, her navy cloak fastened tightly and her umbrella tucked beneath her arm. She was not headed to tea or to the vicarage but to a modest cottage at the edge of the village, one of the newer builds just beyond the allotments. A flickering gas lamp on the front stoop marked her destination, the home of Mr. Edgar Price. Mr. Price was not a name that often came up in local gossip, but he was neither dramatic nor secretive enough to warrant attention. Quiet, always courteous, a widower with no children and a war injury that gave him a slight limp, though not as pronounced as Simon Veal's. He had come to street Mildred's just 3 years earlier and worked part-time as a clerk in the post office before retiring fully the previous spring. There had never been anything odd about Mr. Price. But it had not escaped Miss Marple's attention that Mr. Price had been present at the picnic. Nor that he had once lived for several years in Tanganyika before settling in England, to something he'd mentioned casually at the garden club last autumn while admiring the hardiness of East African lilies. Nor had it escaped her notice that he had been conspicuously absent from every conversation about the Major since the murder. She knocked, brisk but polite. After a moment, the door opened. "Miss Marple," he said, clearly surprised. "What brings you out on such a gray evening?" "I thought I might trouble you for a few minutes. I understand you've been unwell these last few days." He hesitated. "Yes." "A touch of the throat." "Quite nasty, really." "I've not been out much." "Ah," she said gently, stepping inside without waiting for the invitation. "It's difficult to rest when the village is so broken." Bar stirred. He led her into a tidy sitting room filled with African carvings and faded books. There was a worn globe in the corner, its surface faded in patches from sun exposure. On the mantel, a photograph of a woman and his late wife, presumably a smiled from a brass frame. "I've made some tea," he offered. "Lovely." As he poured, she watched him closely and not rudely, but with the exactness of someone cataloging mannerisms. His left hand trembled faintly, not from age, but from something closer to tension. "I imagine you heard what happened to Major Redburn," she said after a moment of silence. His back was to her, but she saw the hesitation in his hand. "Yes," he said slowly. "Terrible business." "You knew him, I think." "From before." He turned. "I beg your pardon?" "You were in Tanganyika," Miss Marple said, stirring her tea delicately. "He spent time in Mombasa." "They're not so far apart." "And military men tend to congregate, especially in the colonial outposts." He took a long moment before answering. "Yes. I did know him." "You've never said so before." "There was no reason to." "Until now." He sat down heavily in the armchair opposite hers. His eyes had lost their usual softness. "We were stationed in the same district." He was senior. I was still in field logistics. "You liked him?" Mr. Price gave a short, bitter laugh. "Number." "I tolerated him." "He had charm, yes." "But no honor." "He left things behind to people, promises." "He was always moving forward and never looking back." Ms. Marple nodded. "A young woman named Miriam." "A daughter." "And others, perhaps." He stiffened. "You received a letter from someone, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "From someone who wanted Redburn held to account." "Someone who asked for your help." He looked at her sharply. "You know far too much, Miss Marple." "I only know what I observe." "And I observed at the picnic how you watched him." "Not with curiosity, but with knowledge." "Old knowledge." Mr. Price rubbed his temple. "She wrote to me." "Miriam." "Years ago. Before she died." "Told me about her child." "About his cruelty." "I kept the letter." Miss Marple waited. "I never expected to see him again." "But then he appeared here." "In this village." "Striding about as though the past didn't exist." "When I saw Elsie at the picnic I knew." The eyes. She had Miriam's eyes. "I was certain of it." "You were a friend of Miriam's?" He looked up at her, and for the first time, the pain broke through. "I was in love with her." "But she never saw me." "Only him." Miss Marple's voice was soft. Did you kill him, Edgar? A pause. Then, quietly, number. I thought about it. I'll not lie. I followed him after the picnic. I watched him sit in the garden, smug as ever. I wanted to speak. To shout. But I couldn't. When I saw Elsie walk toward him, I left. I thought she'd confront him. I thought maybe he'd finally do the right thing. But he didn't. No, Mr. Price said bitterly. Cowards rarely do. Miss Marple placed her cup down with a soft clink. You didn't kill him. But someone did. Someone who watched him fail one time too many. Someone close enough to see how his neglect twisted the lives he left behind. He looked at her. You know who it was, don't you? I think I do, she replied. But first I must be very sure. As she stood to leave, he followed her to the door. I couldn't save Miriam, he said. But I would have protected her daughter with my life. Ms. Marple nodded. Perhaps someone else believed they were doing the same. But vengeance, Mr. Price, never brings the healing people imagine it will. Outside, the mist had thickened into a fine fog. As she stepped back onto the road, Miss Marple felt the last veil of uncertainty lifting. One final conversation remained. And when it was done, the murderer would no longer be hidden in the shadows of the past. Chapter 9. The mist over Lemonwood Rise the next morning arrived cloaked in low fog, soft as gauze, casting the village in a silvery hush. Even the usual chirping of birds seemed subdued, as if the natural world, too, was waiting for something to unfold. Miss Marple had risen early, dressed in her dove-gray cardigan, and brewed a pot of English breakfast tea while listening to the slow, deliberate tick of her mantel clock. Her thoughts were already arranged, like pieces on a well-set chessboard. At precisely 9 o'clock, she walked to the vicarage and asked Relevant Prowse for a favor. I wonder if I might use the parish hall for a small gathering this morning, she asked, hands folded gently before her. Just a few people. I believe it's time we had a quiet conversation together. The Reverend, though startled by the sudden request, readily agreed. When Jane Marple requested something, it was rarely without purpose. By 10:30, a small circle had gathered in the parish hall, modest, quiet, and uncertain. A fire crackled in the hearth. 4 chairs had been arranged without fanfare. In them sat Inspector Gray, Mrs. Daventry, Elsie Gibbons, and Mr. Edgar Price. Miss Marple stood before them like a kindly schoolmistress preparing to explain a complex matter with the utmost care. Thank you all for coming, she began. I have asked you here not to accuse, but to illuminate. I believe we are now in possession of all the necessary pieces. The picture has formed. And, like all such things, it is not entirely tidy. The group shifted uncomfortably. Elsie's hands fidgeted in her lap, her eyes cast downward. Cray watched Miss Marple intently, while Mrs. Daventry clutched a handkerchief, white against her black gloves. Mr. Price remained very still. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm, deliberate. The truth is not only about who committed the act. It is about the chain of choices that allowed it to happen. Major Redburn was not a kind man. He sowed sorrow in many lives, then fled from the consequences. One of those consequences sat beside him at the village picnic. His daughter. Elsie flinched. There was a long pause. I had hoped he would acknowledge her, Miss Marple said. Perhaps even redeem himself slightly. But he did not. He dismissed her. He dismissed everyone. And that sealed his fate. Inspector Cray broke in. Miss Marple, are you saying the motive lies with Miss Gibbons? Miss Marple smiled sadly. Number. Elsie was a mirror. But someone else saw what he refused to see. Someone who had watched a young girl grow in silence. Who had heard her speak of her mother's sorrow and her own longing for identity. Someone who could not bear to see the pain repeated. She turned toward Mrs. Daventry. You wrote the letter, Rowena. You hoped confronting Redburn would force him to reckon with what he had done to both you and Miriam. But you did not act beyond words. Mrs. Daventry's face was pale, but she gave a slight nod. Miss Marple looked next to Edgar Price. You, Mr. Price, were perhaps the only one who truly loved Miriam. You came back to England with her final words haunting you. And when you saw Elsie your heart burned for justice. But you did not kill him. He exhaled shakily. Number. The room was utterly still now. Miss Marple's voice grew softer, but clearer. That brings us to the person who did act. Who had motive, opportunity, and emotional proximity. Someone young enough to be overlooked. Someone who, upon seeing Redburn reject her friend, saw red. Her gaze turned, finally, to the door, where the last chair sat empty. I'm afraid one more should be here, Lily Partridge. Cray's eyes widened. The grocer's daughter? She's not just that, Miss Marple said. She's Elsie's closest friend. They walk together every evening. Share secrets. And, I suspect, she was there that night. She followed Elsie to the larches. Saw the encounter. Saw Redburn dismiss her coldly, perhaps cruelly. And she waited. Waited until the house was quiet. Until he walked again into the garden. Miss Marple turned to the inspector. Have you a constable stationed at the Partridges? Cray stood immediately, jaw tightening. Number. But I will within 5 minutes. Mrs. Daventry covered her mouth. Boot to broken bar Lily? She's only 16. Ms. Marple nodded. 16. And fiercely protective. That's the most dangerous kind of loyalty. It burns without judgment. She must have struck him from behind. The Major likely didn't even see her coming. He was vulnerable. Unarmed. She used the Cania perhaps not to kill, but to push, to humiliate. But the pond is shallow and treacherous. The fall and the shock might have been enough. Elsie's voice finally broke the silence. Number. No, she couldn't, she wouldn't, she did it for you, Miss Marple said gently. But no act of vengeance, however well-intended, can remain hidden forever. A knock sounded at the hall door. A constable entered briskly, speaking low to Gray. He nodded grimly. She's confessed. Said she found the cane discarded in the ivy after Elsie left. Said she waited, then confronted Redburn. Ida broken bar escalated. Elsie dissolved into silent tears. Mr. Price closed his eyes. Mrs. Daventry sat, stunned. Only Miss Marple remained still, a quiet figure in grey, as the fire in the hearth gave a single, soft pop. She spoke once more. Grief is a long shadow. It reaches places the heart cannot always follow. But in its wake, we must remember kindness is not weakness. And sometimes, the deepest wounds come not from what people do broken bar but from what they refuse to see. And in that fog-bound hall in the heart of street, Mildred's justice, at last, had found its way home. Chapter 10, Reflections in Still Water. The fog had lifted by Sunday morning, revealing a village washed clean by rain and revelation. In street Mildred's, the news had spread with quiet speed, faster than post, swifter than sermon. Lily Partridge had been taken into custody, though the word custody was whispered with such pity and disbelief it might as well have meant sent to her room. Miss Marple, however, had declined all invitations to discuss the matter further. The vicar had inquired gently if she might like to speak at the Women's Guild meeting about her observations, but she had demurred with a smile and a polite refusal. She had no desire to dwell on the tragedy. Tragedies, she knew, rarely offered satisfying conclusions, only balance, and sometimes, if one was very fortunate, mercy. That Sunday, she sat once again at Lemonwood Rise. The annual picnic had, predictably, been postponed. But a few of the villagers had still come out, bringing blankets and thermoses, determined not to let darkness claim the sunniest spot in the parish. Miss Harmon sat beside her, knitting something that looked vaguely like a tea cozy but might well become a hat. The relevant Prowse stood by the elder tree, offering soft encouragement to a young boy who was terrified of bees. Miss Marple, as always, observed. But her gaze was turned inward more than usual. The case had not been complicated in the traditional sense. There had been no exotic poisons or forged documents. No hidden wills or locked room puzzles. What had made it so difficult to so quietly terribly was the simplicity of it all. A girl had loved her friend. A father had denied a child. And between those two truths, a life had been extinguished. Beside her, Miss Harmon sighed. They say Lily might be sent to a reform home. Miss Marple nodded. Likely. But I hope the court will understand her age, and her heart. She acted impulsively. Out of grief, not malice. Do you think Elsie will stay? I don't know, Miss Marple said softly. She has roots here now. But roots can be shallow, if the soil is too full of memory. She looked toward the larches in the distant sea. Its window shuttered, its garden still. Mrs. Daventry had already made plans to return to her sisters in Cornwall. Inspector Cray had left the village early that morning, the case officially closed, but his men to Miss Marple suspect Ida still troubled by the quiet, unclean edges of the truth. As for Mr. Price, he had stopped by her cottage the previous evening. He had asked nothing, said little. Only left a small wooden carving on her table, an elephant, worn smooth by years of handling. From Miriam, he had said. She kept it by her bed. Said it was for luck. Miss Marple had placed it on her mantel, beside her silver clock. Now, she reached into her basket and withdrew a small envelope. Inside it was the letter, the one signed with the single M. She had thought, at first, to destroy it. But something restrained her. Instead, she walked to the edge of the rise, where the long grass bent with the wind, and carefully buried it at the base of the sundial. Let the earth keep what it already knew. As she returned to her seat, Miss Harmon looked up. You seem lighter today. Miss Marple smiled, folding her hands in her lap. No, not lighter. But perhaps a broken bar a little clearer. As though the water has settled, and we can see the bottom again. The church bell rang in the distance. The children played again. The bees returned to the lilacs. And above it all, the quiet mind of Miss Marple ticked forward and unchanged, but not unmoved. There would be more mysteries, more shadows, more tangled hearts ahead. But for now, she allowed herself this small peace. The case of the Lemonwood cane was closed. And the still waters of St. Mildred's, disturbed but not destroyed, were calm once more.